The air in the Ford Tactical Training Center was thick with the smells of effort and iron. It was a cathedral of controlled violence, a state-of-the-art temple built to forge men into weapons. The grunts of exertion, the rhythmic clank of weights, and the sharp hiss of compressed air from pneumatic resistance machines formed a constant, percussive symphony. In the center of it all, an old man pushed a mop. His name was Vernon Ford, though no one here knew that. To the titans of muscle and sinew who crashed through these halls, he was just Pops, or the old janitor, a stooped figure who moved with a slow, deliberate economy that seemed out of place in a world defined by explosive speed. His back was slightly bent from decades of unseen burdens, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by sun and time. He wore simple gray coveralls, faded and worn, the antithesis of the high-tech tactical gear favored by the facility's occupants. Today, like every day, Vernon moved along the polished concrete floor, his mop leaving a glistening, clean trail in its wake. He was a ghost in their machine, a silent observer of the next generation of SEALs as they honed themselves into instruments of national will. He ignored the stares, the occasional snickers, and the general air of dismissal that followed him like his own shadow. "Yo, Pops, watch the back." The voice was a confident bark, laced with the casual arrogance of youth and proven strength. Petty Officer Cade Jensen, call sign Apex, sidestepped a puddle of soapy water with the grace of a panther. He was the unofficial king of this particular pride of lions, his physique a masterpiece of sculpted muscle, his eyes holding the cold fire of a man who had seen combat and excelled in it. Behind him, his crew of 4 other operators chuckled, their camaraderie a tight, exclusionary circle. Vernon didn't look up. He simply adjusted the angle of his mop, pulling the water back into a contained area, clearing the path. He made no sound, offered no acknowledgement. This silence, this utter lack of deference, was a constant source of irritation for Cade. He thrived on respect, on the clear lines of the pecking order. The old man's refusal to engage felt like a quiet defiance, a splinter under Cade's skin. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Cade pressed, stopping directly in front of the mop. He crossed his thick arms, the tribal tattoos on his biceps flexing. "This is a training floor, not a retirement home. We've got an evolution in 10. Need the space clear." Vernon continued his methodical work, mopping around Cade's expensive combat boots as if they were just another piece of immovable equipment. He worked with a patience that seemed geological in scale. For a man like Cade, who lived his life in seconds and milliseconds, this deliberate slowness was maddening. It felt like a personal insult. "Did you hear him, old man?" Another SEAL, a younger operator named Diaz, chimed in, eager to curry favor with the team leader. Apex said, "Move it." Vernon finally finished the section, straightened his back with a soft grunt, and looked at the young men. He didn't look at their faces. His gaze was fixed somewhere on their chests, calm and placid. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held no fear, no anger, no deference. They just held a quiet weight. "Floor will be dry in 5, Vernon said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. It was the first time some of them had ever heard him speak more than a single word. He then turned his bucket and mop and began shuffling toward the janitor's closet, his part in the conversation clearly over. Cade watched him go, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The old man hadn't argued. He hadn't fought back. But he hadn't yielded, either. He had simply stated a fact and moved on, operating on his own timeline, in his own world. To Cade, it was the ultimate sign of disrespect. He looked at his team, who were now watching him, waiting for his reaction. "Whatever," Cade scoffed, turning away to hide his frustration. "Let's gear up." Forget the fossil. But he wouldn't forget. In a world where every man was measured, ranked, and respected based on their physical prowess and proven lethality, Vernon Ford was an anomaly. He was a zero. A nobody. And Cade Jensen was determined to make him understand his place. The campaign had only just begun. Vernon's presence on the base was a low-grade mystery, though few cared enough to solve it. He had appeared about a year ago, taking over the custodial duties from a civilian contractor. He lived in a small, Spartan room in one of the older barracks, a building usually reserved for transient personnel. He kept to himself, ate his meals alone in the galley during off hours, and his only known route was the predictable triangle between his room, the galley, and the training center. The younger SEALs, men like Cade, saw him as a relic. They whispered theories, each more pathetic than the last. He was probably a Navy lifer who never made it past E4, a swabby who spent 30 years chipping paint and was now living on a meager pension. Or maybe he was a washout from BUD/S decades ago, a man so broken by his failure that he had to linger at the edge of the world he could never join, cleaning the floors where real warriors walked. That was Cade's favorite theory. It explained the old man's quiet demeanor as the shame of a failed man. This narrative made it easy to dismiss him, to treat him as part of the furniture. He was an object, not a person. His purpose was to clean up their sweat, their chalk dust, their spilled drinks. He was a function, a utility. And when that utility got in the way, it needed to be moved. The harassment started subtly. A protein shaker accidentally tipped over, its chalky, sticky content spreading across a freshly mopped floor. Cade would offer a sarcastic, insincere apology. "Whoops, my bad, Pops. Got these butterfingers today," and Vernon, without a word, would retrieve his mop and bucket and clean it up all over again. Then it escalated. Heavy kettlebells would be left in the middle of a walkway, forcing the old man to painstakingly maneuver his wide cleaning cart around them. Piles of sweaty towels would be dumped not in the large canvas bins provided, but on the floor right next to them. Each act was a small assertion of dominance, a way for Cade and his crew to remind the old men, and themselves, of the hierarchy. They were the warriors. He was the help. Vernon absorbed it all with that same unnerving calm. He never complained. He never reported it. He simply did his job. He cleaned the spills, moved the towels, and navigated the obstacles. His resilience was a mystery that slowly began to infuriate Cade. The petty officer was used to people reacting to him, with fear, with respect, with anger. He knew how to handle those reactions. But Vernon's stoicism was a mirror, reflecting Cade's own petty cruelty back at him, and he didn't like what he saw, even if he wouldn't admit it. The isolation tactic was Cade's next move. He began to frame Vernon's presence as a detriment to the team's readiness. "We were 10 seconds off our breach time because Pops was mopping the entry point," he'd complain loudly in the locker room. "Command needs to get this guy on a different shift. He's a liability." Some of the other SEALs, younger and more impressionable, started to echo the sentiment. Vernon went from being invisible to being an annoyance. Grumbles would follow him as he worked. Men would pointedly walk through his wet floors, leaving muddy boot prints, forcing him to do the work twice. They were turning him into a collective scapegoat, a safe target for the frustrations and pressures of their demanding profession. Through it all, Vernon endured. His routine was his shield. He rose at 0400, long before the first trainees arrived. He would do a series of quiet stretches in his room, movements that were slow and precise, more like Tai Chi than a typical workout. They were exercises designed to maintain mobility in joints that ached with the ghosts of old injuries. Then he would begin his work, cleaning the administrative offices and classrooms before moving to the gym itself as the sun rose. He worked not like a man beaten down by life, but like a man who had found a quiet purpose in his labor. Every sweep of the broom, every pass of the mop, was done with an efficiency that bordered on ritual. He wasn't just cleaning, he was maintaining a space. He was tending to the temple. The fact that the temple was named for a hero he knew intimately was a private irony he carried in silence. One afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Elias Vance was in his office overlooking the main training floor, reviewing after-action reports. Vance was different from the younger operators. He was older, in his late 30s, with a thoughtful demeanor that sometimes put him at odds with the high-octane energy of the teams. He was a strategist, a thinker, and a keen observer of men. And for weeks, he had been observing the dynamic between Cade Jensen's team and the old janitor. He saw the spilled drinks, the scattered equipment, the deliberate disrespect. And he saw the old man's response, nothing. It was this nothing that intrigued Vance. He had seen men break under the psychological pressure of BUD/S. He had seen operators crumble under stress in the field. But this old janitor seemed to possess a core of absolute granite. He didn't cower. He didn't flinch. He just was. Vance watched as Vernon cleaned a set of heavy rubber mats near the climbing tower. The old man knelt down, and as the sleeve of his coveralls rode up his arm, Vance saw it. A flash of ink on the weathered skin of his forearm. It was faded, blurry with age, but the image was unmistakable to a student of military history. It was the old, unofficial emblem of the underwater demolition teams, the precursors to the SEALs. A frog skeleton, smoking a cigar and holding a stick of dynamite. It was a tattoo you didn't just get. You earned it, in the jungles of Vietnam, on missions that were never spoken of. Vance felt a jolt. That tattoo didn't belong on the arm of a washed-out swabby. He looked closer at the man himself. He noticed the way Vernon's eyes were never still, constantly scanning the room, subconsciously tracking the movements of the 24 operators within it. He noticed the way Vernon carried himself, a certain alignment of the spine, a balance in his step that spoke of a body once trained to a razor's edge of physical perfection. The stoop in his shoulders wasn't the slump of defeat, it was the settled weight of a lifetime of heavy loads. Who was this man? The next day, Vance made a point of intercepting Vernon near the water fountain. "Morning," Vance said, his tone casual. Vernon gave a slight nod. "Sir. Just wanted to say, you do a hell of a job keeping this place in order," Vance began. "It's appreciated." "It's my job," Vernon replied, his voice flat, not inviting further conversation. Vance decided to press a little. "You ever serve?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the surroundings. Vernon's eyes flickered toward Vance for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Vance felt like he was the one being assessed. The pale blue eyes were like probes, searching and measuring. "A long time ago," Vernon said, his voice quiet. "Different Navy." "UDT?" Vance asked directly, his gaze dropping to Vernon's forearm. A veil seemed to drop over Vernon's expression. The brief spark of connection was gone. He pulled his sleeve down. "Like I said, sir. A long time ago," he picked up his bucket. "Floors need doing," he turned and walked away, leaving Vance standing there with more questions than answers. Intrigued, Vance went back to his office and did something he rarely did. He used his security clearance to look into a civilian employee. He typed the name from the janitor's employment file into the database, Vernon Ford. The name was common. Dozens of hits came up. He filtered by age. Still too many. He tried to cross-reference with service records, searching for UDT or SEALs. The system churned for a moment, and then a single line of red text appeared on his screen, record classified, level Omega. Eyes only. Syncs off. Vance stared at the screen. Commander-in-Chief, Special Operations Forces. Omega level. That was a classification so high it was practically mythical. It was reserved for living legends, for covert operations that had shaped history, for men whose entire existence was a state secret. Vance didn't have Omega clearance. The base commander probably didn't have it. It meant that this file was locked down at the highest possible level of the United States military. He leaned back in his chair, a slow whistle escaping his lips. The old man mopping the floor outside his window wasn't a washout. He wasn't a failure. He was a ghost. A ghost of such significance that the entire weight of Sockham was being used to keep his history buried. And Cade Jensen was treating him like garbage. Vance felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. This was not going to end well. The inevitable confrontation came a week later. The atmosphere in the training center was electric. A Hell Week-style stress evolution was underway for a new group of trainees, and Cade's team was acting as the aggressors, pushing the candidates to their absolute limits. The air was filled with shouting, the crash of simulated flashbangs, and the panting exhaustion of men being driven past the point of breaking. Vernon went about his duties, a calm island in the middle of the hurricane. He was tasked with keeping the floors clear of the debris and water being used in the evolution. He moved with his usual unhurried pace, a silent, gray figure amid the chaos. Cade, high on adrenaline and his own sense of power, was in his element. He strode through the gym like a warlord, his voice a bullhorn of insults and commands. He saw Vernon mopping near the kill house, a full-scale mock-up used for close-quarters battle drills. The next phase of the evolution required the trainees to storm the house. Pops. Get the hell out of the way. Cade roared, his voice cracking with authority. We're going live in 60 seconds. Vernon didn't speed up. He was carefully pushing a large puddle of dirty water toward a floor drain, his movements precise to avoid splashing the sensitive electronic targets inside the kill house entrance. To Cade, this was the final act of defiance. In the middle of his simulated war zone, the janitor was refusing a direct order. He marched over to Vernon, his team falling in behind him like a pack of wolves. They formed a semicircle, trapping the old man against the wall of the kill house. They were all massive men, bristling with gear and aggression. Vernon looked impossibly small and frail in their shadow. "I gave you an order, old man," Cade snarled, his face inches from Vernon's. The trainees, catching their breath nearby, all stopped to watch. The instructors, including Lieutenant Commander Vance, watched from the observation deck above. The entire facility went quiet, the only sound the dripping of water from Vernon's mop. The drain was clogged. "Had to clear it," Vernon said calmly, his eyes not on Cade, but on the floor. "Didn't want your gear to get soaked." "I don't give a damn about the gear," Cade spat. "When I say move, you move. This is a place for warriors. You are contaminating it with your weakness. Now get out of our way." To punctuate his statement, Cade kicked the mop bucket. It flew across the floor, spilling a wave of gray water that slapped against the polished concrete. It was a calculated act of humiliation, a final, public assertion of his dominance. Vernon looked at the spilled water. He looked at his empty bucket. Then, for the first time, he lifted his head and looked directly into Cade Jensen's eyes. There was no fear. There was no anger. There was just a profound, bottomless disappointment. The pale blue eyes, which had seemed so washed out and lifeless, now held a focus as sharp and penetrating as a laser. In that gaze, Cade saw the reflection of 100 battles, 1,000 nights spent in hostile territory, a level of cold, hard resolve he had only read about in books. For a split second, the arrogant petty officer felt a tremor of pure, primal fear. He felt like a boy pretending to be a soldier, standing before the god of war himself. Vernon did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood his ground, a frail, elderly janitor holding a mop handle like a scepter, and by his sheer presence, he held 5 of the most dangerous men on the planet at bay. The impossible test wasn't about strength or skill, it was a battle of wills. And Vernon Ford was not yielding. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Cade's bravado began to curdle into uncertainty. His team shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in power. They had expected the old man to scurry away. They didn't know what to do with this silent, immovable object. Cade felt his face flush with anger and embarrassment. He was being challenged, and he had to reassert control. He took a step forward, his hand clenching into a fist. "Jensen." The voice was not a shout. It was a physical force. It hit the training floor like a shockwave, freezing every person in place. It was a voice forged in the fires of command, a voice that had sent men into battle and brought them home again. It carried an authority that made Cade's roar sound like a child's tantrum. Every head snapped toward the entrance of the gym. Standing there was Master Chief Thorne. He was a living legend in the SEAL community, a man whose career spanned 3 decades of conflict. He was the command master chief for the entire base, a figure of ultimate respect and fear. He walked not with the swagger of Cade, but with the quiet, inexorable confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. His eyes, like chips of flint, were locked on Cade Jensen. Thorne strode across the floor, his boots making no sound. The operators parted before him like the Red Sea. He didn't stop until he was standing beside Vernon Ford. He ignored Cade completely. Instead, he turned to the old janitor and stood at something akin to parade rest. His voice, when he spoke, was soft with a respect that stunned everyone present. "Mr. Ford," he said, the title Mr. being the highest form of address for a revered former operator. "I hope I'm not interrupting your work. But I must sincerely apologize for the conduct of this petty officer. It will not happen again." Vernon simply gave a slow, tired nod. "They're young, Master Chief. Full of fire." Thorne's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze to Cade, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "Petty Officer Jensen," he said, his voice dangerously low. "What is your job? Your fundamental purpose as a United States Navy SEAL?" Cade, flustered and confused by this sudden, high-level intervention, stammered. To execute special operations, Master Chief. To defend the nation." "And do you do that by harassing the civilian staff?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with ice. Do you think your strength is measured by how you treat a man who is old enough to be your grandfather? Master Chief, he was in the way of a training evolution, Cade began, trying to justify himself. Silence, Thorne commanded, and Cade's mouth snapped shut. You are standing in a multi-million-dollar facility, petty officer. A place with the best equipment, the best instructors, the best resources a grateful nation can provide. Do you have any idea where it came from? Cade was lost. The Navy. Government funding, Master Chief. Wrong, Thorne said flatly. He pointed a rigid finger at the far wall of the gymnasium. On it was a massive bronze plaque, set into the polished granite. It had been there since the day the building opened, but to the men who trained there, it was just part of the wall, ignored background noise. Read it, Thorne ordered. Out loud. Now. All eyes went to the plaque. Cade, his face pale, walked toward it as if he were marching to his own execution. He stood before the gleaming bronze, his own reflection a distorted mask of disbelief. He began to read, his voice barely a whisper at first, then growing stronger as Thorne glared at him. The Vernon Deadeye Ford Tactical Training Center, he read, his voice cracking on the name. Louder, petty officer. So the trainees you were trying to impress can hear you. Thorne boomed. Cade took a shaky breath and started again, his voice now echoing in the cavernous, silent room. Dedicated to Master Chief Petty Officer Vernon Ford. For valorous service far above and beyond the call of duty. Over 30 years of distinguished service with the underwater demolition teams and naval special warfare. Recipient of the Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. 4 bronze stars with valor. Cade's voice faltered. He looked from the plaque to the old man in the gray coveralls, who was now quietly retrieving his spilled bucket. The connection was impossible, unthinkable. But the name was the same. The age was right. Keep reading, Jensen, Thorne commanded, his voice relentless. Read the last part. The citation. Cade's eyes scanned the final lines of engraved text. His face went from pale to ashen. He began to read, his voice now a choked, strangled thing. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life. During the fall of Saigon. Master Chief Ford, single-handedly defending the embassy rooftop helipad against overwhelming enemy forces. Ensured the safe evacuation of the final 34 American and Allied personnel. He was the last man out. For this action, President Gerald Ford awarded him the Medal of Honor. A collective gasp went through the room. The trainees, the instructors, Cade's own team, they all stared, dumbfounded, at the quiet janitor. The man they had mocked, the man they had dismissed as a failure, was a hero of the highest order. A living legend. Deadeye Ford. They all knew the stories. He was a myth, a figure from the history books. And he had been mopping their floors. Cade looked as if he had been physically struck. He stumbled back from the plaque, his eyes wide with horror and shame. He looked at Vernon, who was now just standing there, holding his mop, his expression unreadable. But Master Chief Thorne was not finished. He stepped forward, his voice dropping to a conversational, yet utterly damning, tone. You think the story ends there, Jensen? You think this man just faded away? Let me tell you what real service looks like. When this facility was just a line item on a budget, destined to be cut, Master Chief Ford heard about it. He took his entire life savings, every penny he ever earned, and he cashed out his disability pension from the wounds he took saving those people in Saigon. He donated it all, anonymously, to the Navy SEAL Foundation to ensure that this generation, would have the best place in the world to train. The silence in the room was now absolute, a crushing weight of shame. He didn't want a building named after him, Thorne continued, his eyes boring into Cade. He fought them on it. But the Commandant of the Marine Corps and the Chief of Naval Operations overruled him. And when it was built, he asked for one thing. He asked for a job. He said service never ends. He said if he was too old to fight alongside you, he could at least clean up after you. He mops these floors, Jensen, not because he has to, but because he believes in you. He believes in the mission. He believes in the brotherhood that you have so thoroughly desecrated today. Thorne let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow to Cade's shattered pride. He then turned to Cade's team. And you four. You stood there and let it happen. You followed this arrogant child instead of your own conscience. You are unworthy of the trident you wear. He turned back to Cade. Petty Officer Jensen, you are hereby relieved of all leadership duties, effective immediately. You and your entire fire team will report to me at 0500 tomorrow morning for 30 days of remedial training. Your new training area will be the base latrines. You will learn the meaning of service and humility from the bottom up. Is that understood? Yes, Master Chief, Cade whispered, his head bowed, his entire world collapsed around him. I can't hear you. Thorn roared. Yes, Master Chief. Cade and his team shouted in unison, their voices cracking with humiliation. Dismissed, Thorn said, turning his back on them in the ultimate gesture of contempt. He then walked back to Vernon, his demeanor softening once more. Sir, he said, taking the mop from Vernon's hand. Let us handle this, he gestured to Lieutenant Commander Vance, who was already descending the stairs from the observation deck, his face a mask of grim respect. Vance and 2 other instructors took the cleaning equipment from Vernon. We've got it, Master Chief, Vance said to Vernon, his voice filled with an awe he could no longer hide. Vernon looked at the young men, at the disgraced Cade Jensen being led away, at the stunned trainees. He looked at Thorn, a man he had known as a young lieutenant. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. They're good kids, John, he said, using Thorn's first name for the first time. They'll learn. That's why we built this place. With that, he turned and shuffled toward the exit, his work for the day done. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered. In the days that followed, a profound change swept through the Ford Tactical Training Center. The story of what had happened spread like wildfire through the entire naval base. Vernon Ford went from being the invisible janitor to a revered icon overnight. His status was formally, and publicly, elevated. At the next base-wide formation, Master Chief Thorn, with the base commander at his side, called Vernon to the front. They presented him with a newly minted command coin, a gesture of ultimate respect, and the commander publicly thanked him for his ongoing service, both past and present. Vernon accepted it with his usual quiet humility, saying only a few words of thanks before retreating from the spotlight. He had no interest in the accolades. The shift in the peer group was the most dramatic. The young SEALs, who had once seen him as a piece of furniture, now saw him as a monument. They would part for him in the hallways, their boisterous talk falling silent as he passed. They would nod respectfully, calling him Master Chief, a title he had not officially held for decades. Some of the younger men, the ones who had been most complicit in Cade's harassment, made a point of approaching him individually. Diaz, the one who had echoed Cade's taunts, found Vernon by the lockers one evening. He stood shifting his weight for a full minute before speaking. Master Chief, he began, his voice thick with shame. I just wanted to apologize. For my behavior. There's no excuse, sir. I was wrong. Vernon paused his work, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the young operator, and for the first time, a hint of a smile touched his lips. It's all right, son, he said. Pride is a heavy rucksack. Learn to pack it light. He patted the young man on the shoulder and went back to his work, the matter closed. The gesture of forgiveness was more powerful than any punishment could have been. Cade and his team were gone, swallowed by the punitive machine of Master Chief Thorn. Rumors filtered back that their remedial training was brutal, a soul-crushing regimen of the most demeaning tasks on base, all performed under Thorn's unforgiving eye. They were being broken down to their foundation so they could be rebuilt as better men, not just better warriors. Cade's downfall was complete, public, and a direct result of his own arrogance. A week after the incident, Lieutenant Commander Vance found Vernon sitting on a bench outside the training center, watching the evening colors ceremony. Vance sat down next to him, leaving a respectful distance. I should have known, Vance said, breaking the silence. I saw the tattoo. I tried to look you up. Hit a wall of pure red tape. Vernon watched the flag being meticulously folded. Some walls are there for a reason, Commander. Still, Vance said. The way they treated you. I'm sorry I didn't step in sooner. You did what you could, Vernon replied. But some lessons, a man has to learn for himself. That boy, Jensen. He's strong. He's skilled. but he thought the trident made him a king. He had to learn it just makes you a servant. A servant to the men on your left, the men on your right, and the country you swore an oath to. They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the last rays of sun disappear. Finally, Vernon pushed himself to his feet with a quiet groan. "Well," he said. "Floors won't mop themselves." Vance watched him walk back toward the entrance of the building that bore his name, a stooped old man in faded gray coveralls, ready to continue his silent, humble service. The next morning, as Vance walked into the gym at 0500, he saw a young SEAL trainee, one of the new batch, spot a stray piece of trash on the floor. The trainee paused his workout, walked over, picked it up, and threw it in the bin. It was a small act, almost insignificant. But to Vance, it was everything. The lesson was taking hold. The new order had begun. The legacy of Vernon Ford was not just in the bronze on the wall, but in the quiet acts of service he inspired in the men who now knew his name.